We are very thrilled to welcome Professor Nidhi Sitapathy from MIT to my talks this week. Professor Sitapathy is a Frederick and Carl Middleton Career Developmental Professor in the Brain and Cognitive Science and Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. In this talk, Professor um, Nidhi will present our work uncovering the principles of safe and efficient motor behavior in biological intelligence and how we can learn from that for building better robots. People are welcome to jump in and ask questions anytime, and I will hand over the time to Nidhi.
Okay, thanks everyone for taking the time to come to this talk. Can you all see my slides?
Yep, yes,
And hopefully there isn't like a little box blocking it, with for the Zoom thing, right? You can see the entire slide.
yes, yes.
Good. Okay, so the today I'm going to talk to you all about some predictive principles of motor behavior that we've uncovered over the past decade or so. So the central motivation for the kind of work that I do is that sensory motor control in robots is still not human-like. Obviously, it's come a long way. As you see on the left, there's this robot that's walking down a slope that's pretty uneven terrain. And then you have obviously the famous Boston Dynamics videos that can do really impressive athletic skills. But I would argue that they still don't have the safety and efficiency guarantees that humans have, which is in part the reason why we don't see them out in the world with us right now. Because I think, like having a few videos that look nice is an entirely different story than having statistics that show that the thing reliably moves safely and efficiently. And on the right hand side, you see this robot, for instance, falling down, and these kinds of falls and unsafe events typically happen. Also, a core motivation for my work is also not really autonomous robots, it's wearable robots and being able to predict human movement to be able to inform better wearable robots. And so, can we take inspiration from humans for these kinds of to glean some principles that will help us design more efficient and safe and versatile robots, be they autonomous robots or wearable robots? So, motor behavior is efficient, stable, and versatile. For highly practiced and learned tasks, we choose movements that are highly energy efficient and also stable. In the face of a novel environment, we're able to sort of explore different solutions and find the safe solution in a sample efficient manner, meaning we do it sort of relatively quickly. We also do it safely in that we don't sort of typically hurt ourselves too much in the process. Whereas robots are often like broken during the learning process or even during like simulation, they sort of fall many times when they're simulated. And then if you look at this person, they're doing this very impressive task. Obviously, not all of us can do this. I certainly can't, but this is a very complex environment, and this person is very versatile. They're able to deploy the correct control policy in the face of the correct environment. And so the goal of my research group is to identify principles that underlie such high performance motor behavior. And so we have a framework to do this, and this is the framework that you see. So we've broken down these principles into three computational, let's call them categories. So one is identifying the correct costs and rewards that underlie complex motor behavior. The second is identifying sort of the structure of the controller, which is which states and which actions do we care about in different tasks and how do we map them, and how are these control policies chosen in a way that's both efficient and stable. And the way that that happens is typically with the right learning rules. So typically the learning rules that we have for movement need to achieve this dual goal of remaining sort of efficient, being stable, and also remaining safe during exploration. So while we are exploring the solution space, we don't want to like fall down or break something. Okay, and so this is the overall framework. This is how I like to think about these computational principles of motor behavior. And I would argue that while we understand sort of pieces of all of these components that I've outlined here in the literature already, I would argue that our current understanding is overwhelmingly limited to non-ethological behaviors. So, be they sort of reaching to a point on a plane or sort of pressing a button, things like that. And I think locomotion is sort of more complex and ethologically relevant than many of these behaviors. But why locomotion? Why do I not study, for instance, in hand manipulation, right? Why does my lab focus on locomotion? When I say locomotion, I typically don't mean treadmill locomotion, like steady state treadmill locomotion. My lab really tries to focus on transient, non steady state locomotion. And the reason for this is biologically, it's just a very fundamental, ubiquitous behavior that's shown across a lot of species. And so, if we want to, uncover principles that are not only relevant to humans but also across species, I think locomotion is a great movement that is complex enough, but maybe not too complex that other species don't even exhibit it. And it's exhibited in things like food seeking, evasion, avoiding injury by falls, navigation, exploration. So it's really ubiquitous. And I think locomotion is also computationally very interesting because it is a long horizon task. And because it's a long horizon task, animals typically combine some aspect of planning and feedback control, so sort of predictive modeling and feedback control when they're executing locomotion in complex everyday settings. It involves many sensory modalities. So you need vision, you need proprioception, you need the vestibular control, which is largely absent actually in many other tasks. If you look at reaching, and if you look at manipulation, usually the interaction with the vestibular system is sort of much less central than it is in locomotion. And also, there are many possible actions and many possible control policies. So it's quite a redundant sort of solution space that we seem to navigate pretty effectively. And it's also driven by multiple high level goals, like the desire to not fall down, the desire to remain efficient, the desire to achieve some sort of task specific goal. And so it really is sort of, to me, complex enough without being too complex. And so, in the first part of my talk, I'm going to focus on the costs and rewards that underlie locomotion and what we've learned over the years about this. So, one work that I contributed to was trying to identify the cost function that underlies everyday locomotion, and the key idea here was to generalize energetic cost functions beyond steady state settings. So, we've known already for a very long time now that minimizing metabolic energy cost is a good predictor of the speeds that humans walk at. But typically, what we had known is that it predicts the speed that you would choose when you're walking for a very long distance in a straight line, and this is what we call steady state behavior because there's no transients, there's no sort of variations in the task itself as a function of time. And so we really wanted to see if this principle of energy minimization generalizes to more transient and non-steady state settings. And so the way that we went about doing this is we first measured the metabolic energy cost. We came up with ways to measure the metabolic energy cost of these transients. And the way we did that is actually by designing steady state tasks that sort of capture the transient in question. So, to be more precise, instead of having you walk on a treadmill for a very long time and then measuring the metabolic energy cost there, we had individuals walk in circles of different radii at different speeds and then quantified the metabolic cost for those tasks. Or we had them walk on a treadmill while their speed was varying sinusoidally about the speed of the treadmill, and we did that for different variations. And so this is the reason why we need to take sort of a transient component and map it to a steady state but still time varying task, is because of the way the metabolic energy consumption device works. You need to average it over the entire task, right? So this was a way to elicit the transient component through a steady state task. And then once we did that, we now have sort of energy landscapes for humans in theory for that involve turning and changing speeds as well. Okay. Yeah. There's a question? Okay. So By the way, I forgot to say this, but if you have questions while I'm speaking, feel free to jump in. There's a lot of ground to cover here, and so it might be better to just ask now because not everything is directly connected to everything else. Okay, so we now have this energy cost function, and so if this fundamental theoretical principle of energy minimization is to be sort of is predictive in more than just steady state behavior, we should be able to predict some aspect of transient behaviors using now the addition of these transient costs. And so this term you see here is the old steady state cost, and the term you see here in the cost function is the transient cost. And when we include this, we are able to we seek to predict behaviors for a lot of different tasks. So one is navigating endpoint constraints, where you have one doorway and then you have another doorway that are at different angles with each other, and then the individual has to choose both the path and speed with which they'll navigate these two doorways. There are different there are bouts of different length, and as you might imagine, unlike walking in a straight line for a very long time as you do on a treadmill, when you start and stop frequently, there is the cost of acceleration and deceleration as well, which becomes an increasingly dominant portion of the total cost as the distance you walk gets shorter. And then obviously also predicting the preferred speeds that people choose when they're walking in circles, when they're walking on arbitrary curved paths like the one you see here, when they're navigating a curved corridor, when they're turning in place. And so there's really, as you see now, when you add these transient costs, our ability, our sort of, forget whether we get it right or not, our ability to predict behaviors just increases manifold just with the addition of these two simple cost components. And so was the model actually able to predict the behavior? Yes, we did qualitative comparisons, and we found that the model is able to predict the paths and speeds that people choose across these different conditions that I just outlined to you in a lot of different conditions. So now clearly minimizing energy cost seems to be a predictive principle of motor behavior, right? I like to treat these kinds of theoretical principles in the way such that we want to not try to keep on broadening them to an infinite point, but rather at some point when it's impressively broad, like energy minimization is, maybe the more interesting thing to do is to break it and see where the principle fails to explain behavior. And so one sort of place where I've been consistently challenged on this is in motor development. And so I work a lot with developmental scientists these days. And energy minimization seems like such a silly, silly theory when you look at how babies move, right? And do babies at all care about minimizing metabolic energy cost? And so this is what we really wanted to test is, do we at all need to incorporate energy minimization in any way to explain how babies explore in an embodied setting? And so which embodied setting that were we looking at? This is a setting that babies encounter in everyday life, which is just essentially a room with toys, and then a room without toys. So there's a room where there's a lot of toys for the baby to interact with, and there's another room where the baby doesn't really need to interact with anything, but it still moves, which is really interesting. And this work was done in collaboration with Justine Hoch and Karen Adolph, for both developmental psychologists. And so the hypothesized costs and rewards here, the first one is that they seek out external stimuli, which is a very uncontroversial hypothesis, right? In fact, I would say that is the dominant hypothesis in developmental science, is that babies are very curious about the external world and stimuli that are external to them. And then we added this new hypothesis, which we think is relatively novel, which Karen's body of work has in some sense incorporated for a long time, but without any formal mathematical specification, which is that babies also maximize some internal reward for movement. So this is a curiosity, but it's specifically a curiosity about movement, right? So it's not a curiosity about the world. You're not seeking out something in the world, but you just want to move for the sake of moving. And that in itself is rewarding. And then the third one is, of course, this classical idea that has been very dominant in the adult human locomotion literature, but that they also care about effort cost. And so this kind of trade-off between rewards and effort costs is very naturally it fits in very naturally with optimal foraging theory, which is a sort of very classical theory that explains how animals search for food, how they navigate the explore exploit trade-off in food. And interestingly, the optimal foraging theory has never been used to explain infant behavior. And so this is something that we became really interested in: is, are infants optimal foragers? And if they are optimal foragers, what are the costs and rewards for which optimal foraging is like a good model of infant behavior? And so specifically, we formalized it roughly in this way. You have a baby, the baby is in a room. The baby wants to maximize external reward, which is it wants to sort of learn about the world, but it also wants to minimize effort cost, as well as it wants to also move for the sake of moving, right? And so we incorporated this into a classic optimal foraging theory model. I won't go into sort of the mathematical formulation of it in the interest of time, but essentially the model will make predictions of the kind that you see here. This is the simulated version of the toy room, a simulation version of the no toy room, and it will make predictions that if the baby starts here, what paths and speeds should it choose in this room with toys, what paths and speeds should it choose in a room without toys. Importantly, not unlike babies, the model also will move around even in a room without toys, right? And this will interestingly happen for all cost functions. One might think that, oh, when there is not any reward for internal movement, why would the baby still move? Well, the baby, even those simulations do move finitely because they want to learn about the world. And then at some point, they realize that the world is sort of very sparse, doesn't have any external reward, and then they'll stop moving. And so we tested all these different hypotheses and we gave them fun names. And so for the version of the model that involves external reward, internal reward for movement, and effort cost, we called that a wandering forager. The reason we called it a wandering forager is because just these first two, the external reward and effort cost alone is the classic foraging model. And then we add this internal reward for movement that Karen's body of work has always hypothesized. And this model, when incorporated with the classic optimal foraging theory model, but adding this additional reward for movement, actually explains the behavior both in the toy room and the no toy room of the babies pretty well. But then the question is, do we really need all these components? For instance, do we need effort cost? Do we need this internal reward for movement to explain the behavior? And so we made versions of the model that didn't have these costs. And the answer is surprisingly yes. We actually do need some sort of effort-like representation to match the infant's data, which is perhaps the most surprising relative to the developmental science literature, is that without this representation for an effort-like cost, we actually don't capture the entire spectrum of infant behavior. And we also need this internal movement for reward. So Karen's body of work is absolutely correct. Babies do move for the sake of moving. And so they have this sort of kinesthetic curiosity, which we have formalized here as this internal reward for movement. And so in summary, it seems that babies have they care about external reward, they care about effort cost, and they care about sort of movement for the sake of moving. Okay. So just to summarize, so my lab is doing other work in this space of inferring what the costs and rewards are. But so these are the two studies that I've chosen to talk about. So to summarize, adults seem to choose navigation paths and speeds that minimize the total metabolic cost of the energy cost of their movements. Importantly, this is different than the classical sort of work that focuses on cost of transport, which is the total cost divided by the distance over which you move or something like that. In this case, we're almost closer to the cost to go, which is in classic optimal control theory, where it's the total cost that it takes to do the task, not normalized in any way by the task itself, that explains behavior across these broad range of conditions. And then in infants, we found surprisingly that while infants may seem like they are wasting a lot of energy compared to us, it actually turns out that maybe really what they're doing is they're using effort as a currency to keep track of how rewarding the world and their own movements are. So effort is somehow acting as this common currency that is helping them even the scales or tell when a particular environment is maybe too boring or when their movements are maybe not interesting anymore. And so they still need a representation of effort to be able to tell if they're spending too much effort in a given environment or not. And so, some implications of this work for the kind of work that I figure you all do is that humans minimize the total cost of their actions, and of course, most reinforcement learning models have some kind of minimization of effort now. But I would argue that maybe one good move for us as a field is to actually start challenging the formulations of the cost function and not just reward shaping, but actually taking inspiration from biology for how those cost landscapes are structured in a deeper way. And also, it seems that infants do sample efficient exploration by weighting reward against effort spent, and this has implications for developmental science research. Um, and finally, there's obviously a lot of biomedical applications for this kind of work. Once we have a better estimate of the cost landscapes underlying human behavior, we can incorporate these cost landscapes into wearable robots and the decisions that they make to help them aid us in a more efficient way. So I'm actually going to pause here and give you all an opportunity to ask me a question before I move on to the next two parts, just so we don't only get questions on the last part.
Yeah, I have a few questions. First, like, are there differentiation between the toys, like, for the babies? Like, for example, like they will move for one, like like a panda toy, but not a cat, like something like that.
That's
Yep.
That's a great question. So actually, this is an immediate next study that Justine and I have planned. Right now, we're just trying to explain sort of high reward landscape and low reward landscape, right? Toy and no toy. That's what we want to explain now. But we're really interested in seeing if the value of the toy also changes behavior and how that interaction changes over time.
And also, how do you separate sensory motor development from the cognitive development in the babies, right? Like for example, like with babies in their like 1 or 2 year old, like maybe they don't even have like object permanence yet, or like they don't have really good spatiality yet. Like the visual cliff, like the famous visual cliff. Like how do you deal with those kind of like their spatial understanding is not good, like like when they have this kind of
So
embodiment.
that's a great point. So these agents, I didn't go into the details of the model, but these agents have actually finite vision horizon around them, and that is actually a proxy for many things. It's a proxy for low-level things like how well they can see. It's also a proxy for more cognitive things like working memory, like how much do they remember the most recent thing they saw, right? And so the results are pretty robust qualitatively to those details of sort of how big of a window we choose. And maybe actually a simple way of thinking about when the baby ceases to be a baby and becomes an adult is when they actually have a mind as large as the room in some sense, right? So if you can stand in one corner, span the entire room, then you're not a baby anymore and you know that the room is not worth exploring or something like that. And whereas for babies, because they have this finite visual horizon, limited working memory, they need to rely on movement to continuously provide them with information about the world, right, in some sense. So that's to answer your question. So in other words, I think when our cognitive resources are poorer, sometimes we may need to rely on our motor system to provide information that our cognitive system cannot provide.
Oh, so you put that as a state, like in your model.
It's not a state, it's just how much information does the agent have at any given point in time. It only has like n boxes around where it is. Can you see my cursor, by the way?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, okay, good. Yeah, so it can only see like n boxes around itself. Whereas for an adult, you might argue that an adult standing here might know what's going on in the whole room, right?
Oh, so it's kind of like the sensor of the agent, right? Like
But I
the
think it's a computational sort of abstraction that, in my opinion, can represent sort of perceptual, like babies can't see very far, right? Also, and also it can also perceptual limitations like not being able to see very far. It can also represent sort of working memory limitations like not remembering if I was here 2 minutes ago, forgetting what was there, right? To your point about object permanence, like if I was near this toy, once I move here, I forget there's a toy here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yes. So, but like, so did you try to like play with the parameter, like these parameters, like keeping the cost, and then do you see like how much is the variation of the behaviors of the total behavior, the human behaviors?
Yeah, note here that we're just trying to get sort of we're just trying to explain this difference between the toy room and the no toy room, right? And so I'm confident that even with variations in that parameter, like this model still wins out overall.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like the toy and the not toy room should be easily explained with that model. But
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about like how much cognitive modeling you need to play into the sensory motor modeling. Like
I consider this study at the cognitive motor interface because actually, if you look at work, in there's a lot of cognitive scientists like Yael Niv and so on who've used optimal foraging theory to explain decision making. So I would say this model squarely sits at the decision making. One might argue it's actually a little more decision making than motor control, but I would say the piece that motor control brings in is the effort cost.
I see. Yeah. Th- yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Like I guess I will ask more like through the end. Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions on this part?
Hi, maybe I have a quick question.
Oh,
My
I
name
can't
is
hear you,
Irfan.
Irfan.
Is it
Yeah, now I
audible
can hear
now?
you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Hi, this is Irfan. I'm from the University of Twente. I have a brief question about costs. I'm really curious, where does the costs completely shift to only reducing metabolic costs, or eventually where do we get to that point? Because I would also imagine, right, when you're an adolescent or a teenager, let's say they also tend to say show off, and then they might do things that are that more the cost consumes more energy just to sort of stand out from the group. So maybe there are some teenagers with a different costs, but others. Is that, do you also see that there's a development stage where it sort of becomes more towards curiosity, and then afterwards there's a point where it switches to completely reducing metabolic cost? Do you have a hypothesis on that?
I love this question because I think this also gets at, similar to Hawkins' previous question, it gets at a very interesting future direction, which is actually tracking these weights, right? So I've not shown the weights here because this is just a cartoon figure, but each of these terms have these weights, right? And so there's these trade-offs between effort, external reward, and internal reward. And it would be really interesting to see how these weights shift on developmental timescales. Now, this is specifically for like physical locomotor exploration, but I feel like your question almost applies to sort of the explore exploit trade off in general, not specifically for sort of embodied exploration. And so I think developing these kinds of foraging models with this internal, with explicit representations for curiosity, and then seeing how the weights change, like collecting data on individuals on developmental timescales and seeing how the trade-offs change as a function of age would be a very interesting sort of scientific thing, like you said, Irfan. And also I think it'll provide like maybe a basis for diagnostics because there are some sort of disorders like ADHD that might fall differently on this trade-off spectrum. But we're specifically interested in embodied exploration because that's sort of closest to the motor end of things.
Cool. Thank you so much. Really cool work there.
Thank you. I'm gonna move on if there are no more questions, but feel free to drop them in the chat, or also, email me later. So that's one sort of predictive principle is costs and rewards. The other principle is controllers. I think unlike the costs and rewards, controllers, I would argue, have actually not been shown to have that much relevance for prediction yet, but I actually think they are very relevant. Choosing the correct states and the correct actions that map onto a control policy. And so this is sort of a newer piece that we think is a contribution to the field. And right now, I would say that we're more in the stage of figuring out what the structure of the controller is, rather than trying different controller structures in simulation and seeing which predicts data better. That's kind of a next step. So you'll see a kind of shift in this part of the talk where I'm talking more about data-driven work, where it's more at the discovery stage than building predictive sort of models and theories yet. And so what is a controller? Actually, let me spend one more second on this slide. So many of you probably use deep reinforcement learning. You know what or if even if you just do optimal control, you know what a control policy is. You keep track of some states of the body, typically in movement. If you're doing sort of movement in the presence of an object, you also need to keep track of the object state. And then you choose some set of actions, and then you map these states to actions to have a policy. And hopefully this policy is such that it's stabilizing. And this obviously has to do with how you learn the policy, but let's not get into that. For now, let's just look at the policy on execution timescales. Okay, and so you have this mapping between the states of the body and the action. So if you find yourself in a slightly different state, you'll take actions to bring you back to where you want to be. And so this is this sort of continuous interaction between the desired state and where you actually are, and taking actions that are corrective in this sense. And so it's intricately tied to stability, right? So these policies are intricately tied to stability, because as soon as there's an error that's perceived in the states, it will have this stabilizing property. So I like to call these stabilizing controllers, okay? And so human movement is inherently stable, meaning that we have these nominal periodic motions. If you look at locomotion, we have on a treadmill. Let's just look at locomotion on a treadmill for simplicity. We have this limit cycle which closes on itself in state space. And so if you plot the states that a person's body is in during locomotion, it will often form these closed loops over many steps, right? And then you can have perturbations, right? So either due to the world or due to sort of intrinsic sensory motor noise, for various reasons, you may just go off of this limit cycle onto this red path that you're seeing here. And then you need some sort of stabilizing controller to bring you back on track, or you just ignore it, right? So there's probably a threshold value of noise or errors that we don't even care about. But when it goes over a certain bound, we want to make some correction. And so these sort of stabilizing control policies are really important to enable both error-free movements, and actually, if you think about it, also efficient movements. Because the more you're sort of, you have sensory motor noise, you don't correct it, you're just going to be sort of drifting around and sort of wasting energy in your movement. And so the more you stay close to the desired trajectory, in a sense, you're also being more efficient. Okay. So how are these controllers typically formalized? This is a very simple mathematical representation of the controller with an important choice that's different from typical deep reinforcement learning policies, which is that we distinguish between the desired movement and the actual movement. So in most sort of vanilla deep reinforcement learning models, there's a direct mapping between the full states and a mapping to the actions. Whereas in the kinds of models that we build, we actually distinguish between these. We say, oh, U0 and S0 are the desired states, and humans only make corrections when we deviate from the desired states, right? And so typically these desired states are derived from the costs and rewards that I spoke to you about. So this is, like, in summary, the feed forward and the feedback component of the controller. And so the sub-zero ones are going to be the feed forward components, and then the ones that don't have a sub-zero are the feedback components. And so in the most general case, there is some general mapping between the two. And again, the key difference is that we're treating these two as separate representations, maybe having different underlying neural control for the S0s and the S's, okay? Whether this is true or not, I think is still an open question, but it's in our experience, it seems to predict behavior better. So if we, theoretically, if we know what this function H is that maps the states to the actions, then we can predict how humans will respond to any perturbations, or how they'll behave in any state. And so what we want to do is do this kind of system identification to infer these functions in different ways. So one thing, of course, is one way to do the system identification is to actually perturb people in sort of infinite different ways. And that gets very quickly intractable. It's a very, very ambitious set of experiments that somebody should do someday. My lab is certainly trying to do it, but I think in the short run, it's not realistic. So instead, can we infer the structure of this controller from natural variability? So early on, the way we used to do this is we would hypothesize some body states. And then we would hypothesize the structure of the controller, and then we would also hypothesize the actions, then we would just infer the gains from data, right? So this is the hypothesis-driven version of the system identification. And so the way we would do this is we would have variability in the actions, which in this case is where you put your foot down, right? So where you choose to put your foot down. Of course, the most proximate action is in the muscle space, but that's intractable for various reasons that we can discuss later. So we've abstracted it to where you put your foot down. And then we have also the forces, which is how hard you hit the ground. And so this was for running, but I want to at a high level explain how this framework works, because Manoj Srinivasan, who's the person I did this work with, has also done this for a lot of other tasks. And so you specify typically in the way we used to do this before, you specify what the input states of the controller are, you specify what the output actions are. In this case, the inputs are going to be the state of the center of mass, which is what we think matters in running. And then the output states are going to, output actions are going to be where you put your foot down and how hard you hit the ground. Okay, and so you have this mapping between the states and actions, and this is how you sort of fit or identify this control policy. So once you have this control policy, this is sort of a rudimentary form of imitation learning, which is different from typical imitation learning, because it actually only fits, it makes this assumption about these deviations from the desired states. And so we fit this simulation, this simple physics-based simulation model to sort of these mappings, these data-derived mappings between the body states and the actions. And then we try to sort of both achieve energy minimization and the correct gains. And so once you do that, you now have a simulation that has not just the feed-forward policy that's efficient, it also has the feedback controller embedded in it. And so with this simulated model, what you can do is you can apply a lot of perturbations to the model, and you can see how it recovers from the perturbations to make theoretical inferences about this default controller. Now, let me take a second to explain what a default controller is. What I refer to as a default controller is the sort of error correcting control that is hidden in the natural variability of a task. As I introduced in the beginning, oh, is there a question? Okay. So as I introduced in the beginning, we're not applying perturbations to people to do this system identification. We're mining their natural variability. And so we mine the natural variability, and because of that, we call it a default controller, because it's the controller that is inherent to the task when you just do it naturally, even in the absence of external perturbations, okay? And so we can understand some characteristics of this default controller in simulation in this way. And so what we found very interestingly is that even though this simulation is fit to natural variability, it is actually robust to much larger perturbations. So, if you look along this axis, it seems to be robust to 10x larger perturbations. And obviously this is a simple model, so we can't draw quantitative conclusions, but qualitatively the takeaway here is that the default controller we use for any given movement is actually much more robust than it needs to be just to be stable to the noise. And so this idea would make specific predictions about how people behave in the presence of a small range of perturbations. And so specifically, it would predict that for a relatively sort of different, slightly different environment, say you're walking on flat terrain and then you're walking on slightly different terrain, say you're running on flat terrain and you're running on sort of terrain that has slightly larger perturbations, then you would actually not need to change your control policy at all, because the same control policy that you are using on flat terrain will actually be stable even on the slightly uneven terrain. And so we wanted to test this idea, and so we did the same system identification on uneven terrain running data from Sasha Voloshyna. And interestingly, we found that this is in general true, that we have very, very similar gains, control gains for foot placement control in even on slightly uneven terrain running. Okay, so this is very interesting. So this very simple foot placement controller seems to be robust in during even terrain, and then when you take it to uneven terrain, it seems to sort of, as predicted by this idea, you seem to be able to achieve stable locomotion on uneven terrain during running using very similar gains. But as you think about system identification, unlike cost functions, I would say system identification, when you think about sort of increasingly complex tasks, we did it for treadmill walking, we did it for treadmill running, we did it for treadmill running with uneven terrain. But as you think about doing it for increasingly complex tasks, it becomes quite intractable, right? And so then it feels like you have to take this data-driven approach to make it tractable. And so that's kind of what we wanted to do. We wanted to come up with some sort of framework to do system identification for locomotion, for transient locomotion, and ideally also for other motor tasks. So we wanted to build this somewhat general framework, data-driven framework, to understand the input dependence of the actions and the controller across a lot of different tasks. And so we needed to make a lot of changes. And so first of all, we abandoned the hypothesized sort of hypothesizing specific states and actions and trying to find the mapping between them. So that approach we had to completely abandon. And then so what we are doing now is we're actually taking somewhat of a black box approach initially. I have some thoughts about how we can circle back to the hypothesis driven approach, but I won't get into that today. And so we're doing a lot of different tasks. There's this beautiful data set from John Mathis for humans essentially hiking, right? So it's full IMU 3D kinematics as well as gaze, where they're looking at on sort of flat terrain, medium terrain, and rough terrain on like real actual hikes. So this is people actually hiking. And then we also have a bunch of other data sets. We have data sets on treadmill walking, treadmill running, and also this wonderful data set on treadmill, uneven terrain treadmill running from Sasha Voloshina. And so we wanted to build a framework that generalizes across all these tasks, and we think should generalize also to other tasks, but we haven't shown that in this study. And so the input modalities, so how does this framework work? It's essentially taking all the raw data, including sort of gaze, all the body states, and then only the center of mass relevant states, because we were really interested in understanding how much information the center of mass contains for control relative to the other states, because these abstract models have worked so well historically. Is it useful to add other details at all? And then also the foot placements. And we try to predict future foot placements from past states, essentially asking the question, on what time scale do we need information to predict future foot placements? And we structure this in different ways. We have different artificial neural networks. We tried GRUs, transformers, LSTMs, TCN, so various architectures. And what we found is, interestingly, that some sort of architecture that involves contextual information effectively, like a transformer or a GRU, is much better at predicting future foot placement than the other architectures. And we were able to use these models to understand something about how the control strategy changes across different environments and also across different input modalities. So let's talk about different input modalities. So one thing that we found is that this data-driven model is able to quantify how multi-time scale locomotor control is. So what you're seeing here is the ability of each input modality to predict future foot placement. And in blue is the ability of gaze, which is where you're looking with your eye, to predict future foot placement. In green is the ability of the full body states to predict future foot placement. And then in red is the ability of the center of mass to predict future foot placement. Straight away, you will see that while in terms of R squared, there is not that much benefit of incorporating all the full body states relative to just the center of mass relevant states. What's interesting is that temporally there is an advantage, meaning that the full body states actually contain information about future foot placement before the center of mass relevant states. And then, of course, the earliest information is contained in the gaze information. And so clearly, if you only care about predicting foot placement and not when you predict it, then I think the center of mass information is good enough. But if you also care about predicting it early, then you get some advantages by adding more information for the full body kinematics as well as for gaze. And so this information has relevance for wearable robots. So what are you tracking? Because wearable robots may want to predict where the human is going to put their foot down before the human puts their foot down. And so for that, it seems useful to also look at sort of other full body states, and particularly gaze information, which I would say very few wearable robots right now do. And so, but also scientifically, it tells us something really interesting, which is that as the terrain becomes more complex, it seems that individuals rely less and less on sort of old information. So going back to what we see here, the intercept that the model has for prediction, say at the two-step stage, we're plotting that here on the y-axis, and then the peak, when the peak happens, we're plotting that on the x-axis. And so this is some sort of heuristic to measure how much you rely on early versus last second prediction for control. And you see this very gradual shift in this trade-off between early and late prediction as the environment gets more complex. And so one interpretation of this is that as the environment gets more complex, you're relying less and less on sort of predictive control and more on reactive control. And while that might not be too surprising, what's exciting to me about this is that we can now quantify this trade-off, which we couldn't do before, right? So with this model, we can actually quantify how much you rely on sort of planning versus fast time scale feedback. Okay, so I'll just summarize this part of the talk. Some main takeaways of some of this work is that natural variability contains information about the default controller, which is robust to larger perturbations than sort of natural variability, interestingly. The inputs and the timescale of the controller seem to change more in more complex environments. So what input states we pay attention to and on what time scale we control our movement seems dependent on the environment. And some implications of this work is that we may not need to modify our default controller in some environments, right? So this is, if you think about this idea, it's almost contradictory to the way deep reinforcement learning works with sort of domain randomization, right? You almost try to find the controller that explains all the perturbations first, and then you deploy it in the world. But it seems like people have much more sort of narrow controllers for a given task, but that are still somehow robust. Even though their natural variability is pretty low. And I think there's a lot of interesting work that can be done in formally comparing these simulations and their controllers to humans, which is something that my lab is doing these days. And then also the structure of our controller seems to be tuned to the statistics of the environment. And so, the kind of work that has been done in the perceptual literature to explain, to sort of build theories of how sort of vision, for instance, is tuned to the statistics of our environment, or audition is, I think that kind of work has not really been dominant in motor control. And I think this is a space where it might be. And also, we found, interestingly, that these control structures are pretty conserved across species, which is a paper that we have forthcoming that's in press at PNAS right now. So in mice, flies, this sort of body state dependent foot placement control for stability is pretty well conserved. And so this has implications for medical studies, because we can sort of try to translate the implications of some sort of mechanistic intervention for stability in a mouse and predict how it would affect a human if you have these shared control strategies. And it also it has obvious implications for wearable robots, of course. So that's all about sort of controllers, mainly system identification, not so much prediction here. And so, yeah, I'm open to questions and thoughts on this part as well.
Hi.
Hey.
I actually got questions. I was wondering, do you think when we're trying to find like a locomotion controllers of human working, then doing a pure deep reinforcement learning via imitation learning to like give us better ethological models than via like system identification?
Okay, so let me try to interpret your question and tell me if I got it wrong. So, are you essentially saying that is our current day imitation learning models better than the kind of data driven sort of than the kind of system identification I've outlined here? Is that your question?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, that's my question.
That's your question. Yeah, so we are actually trying to write this up. So obviously, like robotics, in the human animation literature, things like imitation learning and so on, we have the same problem that robotics has, which is that we don't have good benchmarks, right? It's really hard to benchmark sensory motor control, right? And so human likeness is one possible benchmark, and it's something that my lab is working on. But I'll be honest with you, like, I don't know who the audience is for this. Like, so if I'm gonna sort of build benchmarks of human likeness for animation, or for these sort of imitation learning tools, largely the people who build imitation learning models, they're actually working on animation, which is just making the movement look right but not actually be right. Whereas in my world, everybody already knows that animation models don't work well, and they're not a good model of actual human movement because they produce the wrong forces, they have the wrong dynamics, they have the right kinematics but the wrong dynamics. And so we care about the dynamics. And so there's this big gap between folks who build those tools and folks who care about dynamics. And so while I'm interested in writing those papers, I always worry who'll read them, because the animation people don't care about the dynamics, and the people who care about the dynamics don't care about animation. So I'm open to feedback. This is Myo Suite, is like Myo Talks, whatever. What are you all calling yourselves these days? Myo Lab. You are a great sort of a source of information on if you think those kinds of studies would be interesting and who the audience would be for that.
Yeah. Anyone? Bruce, you have a question? Do you want to jump in, or like are you able to speak? Yeah, I guess I will read Bruce's question here is in the chat. Do you think we could also build humanoid locomotion controller via system identification approach by identifying controllers from human locomotions?
I mean, they are already doing this, right? A lot of humanoid models are trained on human movement data. There's a very interesting paper that I was very inspired by, from Jitendra Malik's group, where they pre-trained both on like physics-based simulations, a lot of deep reinforcement learning simulations, videos of people walking to inform like a humanoid controller. So they are already doing that, right? But the question here boils down to human likeness, right? And so I'm in the kind of questions I care about, which is, predicting human movement, informing wearable robots, diagnostics, medical applications. The level of human likeness we care about seems to be very different from the level of human likeness roboticists or animation people care about, right? Because they're not trying to actually model humans. They're trying to take data from humans to make the robots do what they want, or they're trying to take data from humans to make the animation look right, but it doesn't have to actually be right. It can be like creating joint torques that give it osteoarthritis. They don't care, right? Because it's just an animation. So yeah, I'm really curious if you all think it's worth trying to bridge the gap between these fields, or not. And if so, I'd be curious why you think that. But maybe something for you all to think about if you don't have an answer right away. Are there any more questions?
Yeah. Anyone have more questions? I guess we can continue here.
Okay, let's continue. So the final piece that I'm going to talk about today are learning rules, which I would say theoretically I'm most interested in these days, because I think it sort of taps into both costs and rewards and controllers, because the costs and rewards kind of control like what you choose to do next, and the controllers control how you get there in learning, during learning. And so a lot of my sort of theoretical effort is centered around learning these days, but learning in these sort of very embodied tasks, whereas historically motor learning has been in sort of very low dimensional action spaces. So I'm very interested in building human-like models of learning, but you know, in these in locomotion specifically. So the question here is, what principles predict how motor behavior is adapted or learned in a novel setting? And specifically, we're going to use energy stability interaction. So in the first part of this talk, we spoke about energy efficiency a lot. In the second part of the talk, we spoke about stability a lot. And in this part of the talk, we're going to talk about how they both together shape learning and adaptation. And so we were interested in building a predictive model of locomotor adaptation across a lot of different tasks. And so specifically, we wanted to explain how people adapt in the simplest case of quickly varying speeds, having a split belt treadmill, which is a novel environment, arguably very simple novel environment, where one belt is going at a different speed than the other, with the addition of masses to the body, and also in the presence of external robotic assistance. And just to give you, if you've never come across a split belt treadmill before, I just want to show you what that looks like. So you have these two belts that go at different speeds. And then what happens is, after some time, if you switch back to just both belts going at the same speed, there'll be these after effects where people sort of are still asymmetric, even though the world is not asymmetric anymore. And so we actually built a model that's very integrative and borrows from a lot of different corners of the literature for this. So at the lowest level, we hypothesize that humans have this sort of stabilizing feedback controller, very similar to what I spoke about in part 2 of the talk. And then at a higher level, and on a slower time scale, we have this performance improving reinforcement learning module. And then we have this memory module that acts constantly, where we're constantly checking if we should use old memories or modify existing memories based on learning, right? And so with this model, let me talk to you a little bit about the details of the model. How am I doing on time, by the way?
We can, yeah, you're doing great. Yeah.
Okay, good. So we have this, let me take one step back. So I'm going to talk to you first about this piece, which is the stabilizing controller. And so we have a simple biomechanical model that has the states of the center of mass, and the action space is how hard you push off from the ground and where you put your foot down. So this is a very simple abstraction of locomotion, sort of allowing us to explore the theoretical space without getting sort of lost in the muscles, right? And so we have this model, and then we use system identification to get the gains and so on. This was work done by Joshi and Srinivasan for the underlying feedback controller itself. And then mainly what we did is took this existing feedback controller, created sort of let's call it a family of policies for walking at different speeds, and then added the reinforcement learning layer on top of that. And so this was simple policy gradient reinforcement learning. What it does is it has some exploratory noise as well as a step towards memory, which I'll explain in a more detail in a few slides. So I just would like to give you a abstract sketch of what this model looks like and how it's different from, say, an RL model that doesn't interact with a stabilizing feedback controller, right? So, so the way it works is you have a particular cost landscape in a very familiar environment that you know intimately. So this is, say, walking in a straight line at a constant speed, right? And so you have some natural variability that keeps you pretty close to the optimum movement here, right? So this is, you're near optimal in this behavior. And then you're thrown into a new environment, which is this orange landscape. And so now there's this new shifted landscape. And you need to find the right movement for this new task, which is essentially what motor learning is. The problem of motor learning is to find a highly performant movement in a completely novel setting. And in optimization language, what that means is finding the minimum in this orange landscape that you've never encountered before. And so the way the agent does it is it uses some exploration in the neighborhood of its current policy while remaining stable, right? And so the advantage of having a stabilizing feedback controller as the lower level during exploration is that you don't sort of fall or kill yourself during exploration. And so you're slowly exploring the solution space and then finding your way to the new optimum, okay? So now you have the memory module. So the way the memory module works is we were for this piece, we were inspired by sort of Daniel Wolpert's contextual inference work. And so the way that we took inspiration from it, but with some modifications, right? And so we wanted to boil down locomotion into a context, right? And so this is the task specific parameters here. In this case, it is what speed you want to move at, and that is fed into a memory. And then the output of the memory model is both the controller, which is what feedback controller you should use, as well as the performance value. So this is the piece I would argue is sort of missing in Daniel Wolpert's work, is sort of what these output choices are. So we choose it to be the controller as well as the performance value for that given context, okay? And then essentially the model decides whether to use a memorized policy or update an existing policy. And so the way it does that is it takes, there are some current parameters that the reinforcement learner is trying out, control parameters, PI, and there is a particular performance value associated with those parameters. And so if those are good, then you actually want to update your memory because you want to remember this very nice policy that your reinforcement learner has discovered. However, if they are not so good, if they are not performant, then perhaps you want to search your memory for a better policy, right? And so that's how the memory module works. And so it's a very normative theory. This is like, you know, as good as trying to find the best possible solution. And so we want to see where people fall on that, right? People may not be as optimal as the model is. And so that's an interesting theoretical sort of exercise to compare the model to people then. And specifically, and then what the model does is it decides how much to weigh memory versus the current reinforcement learning gradient. And this is done with cosine tuning with some inspiration from computational neuroscience, okay? And so depending on how far apart the solutions are that either memory or the current RL model are suggesting, the model will decide which one to weigh more or less using cosine tuning. Okay, so now we have this model that can predict behavior in novel environments. And so we made predictions across a lot of different environments, 10 to be precise. But in the interest of time, I'm going to talk to you about 2 of them. And so we predicted behavior for adaptation on a split belt treadmill. And what was interesting is that, like humans, the model exhibited this fast time scale asymmetry and then the slow trend towards symmetry, but then actually towards positive symmetry given a little more time, which has been sort of captured in the literature. And so the model replicates human data. It also replicates human metabolic energy data. And also the model replicates the behavior that has been found during this AnkleBot exoskeleton that was developed by Neville Hogan's group. And so essentially it's an entrainment study where they added an AnkleBot and they saw both whether people entrained to the sort of perturbations, the time periodic perturbations of the robot, and at what phase of gait did they entrain. And the model captures both which phase they entrain to and the fact that they entrain. Okay, and so you can look at this paper listed below for more details on the model and what else it predicted. Interestingly, we not only captured learning and adaptation phenomena, we also captured sort of generalization phenomena. So, you know, how do you generalize from one, when you're trained in one environment, how do you generalize to a different environment? And we were able to capture a lot of those phenomena, okay? Okay. So once you have a model like this, there's a lot of things you can do with it, from very theoretical to more practical things. So let me give you an example of one theoretical question we try to answer. If you look at the motor learning literature, whenever there is sort of okay, let's first look at this blue curve that I'm pointing to on the right hand side, okay, or the blue curve here. So this is typical learning, right? So you have this fast time scale asymmetry and then the slow time scale trend to symmetry. That's called very typical learning. Healthy individuals exhibit that. So interestingly, if you have someone with cerebellar ataxia, for instance, they will actually show something that looks like this light blue curve. Okay, where they actually don't show the slow time scale, but they do show the fast time scale dissipation. And so often, because people don't use predictive simulations and they instead do like data fit simulations, this is often interpreted as a learning rate deficit. So when individuals don't show this typical learning curve and they instead show this, it's almost like, oh, they have a zero learning rate, which is one interpretation. What's interesting is that with our hierarchical model that also involves sort of stability and all these other components, you can recapitulate the same behavior actually with high sensory noise. So with a much more low level deficit, one would think of sensory noise as a very low level deficit and like learning rate as something much more high level that maybe happens sort of in the basal ganglia or something, right? Or in the or sort of at a higher level, whereas sensory noise can happen in your muscles, it can happen at a very low level. But interestingly, you get the same deficit in the model if you just have this very low level sensory noise. And so this is just to show that if you have this sort of formal model of adaptation and learning, you can try to distinguish between sort of low level sources of learning deficits and high level sources of learning deficits. Whereas if you have these sort of very fit data descriptor kind of models, then I feel like you're much more biased to attribute everything to high level deficits. Yeah, so let me move on. So I also said that we can use these models to explain for practical applications. And so here's an example of using it for a somewhat more practical application. So one thing that's of a lot of interest in robotics, in wearable robotics, is explaining why humans are actually suboptimal for some wearable robot parameters. And so, while wearable roboticists would love if humans can always discover the optimal solution for all the device parameters, it's a very laborious process to sort of help humans discover the optimal solution in a novel sort of device, right? And so we wanted to create an experimental setting and a model and use our model to understand why this happens. Because one reason why this may happen is because of deficits in learning rather than just in performance. And I would argue that most of the literature is focused on sort of treating these deficits as sort of an execution deficit rather than a learning deficit. And so we take this very learning centric view here. And so if you take these models that don't take learning into consideration, like just trajectory optimization, the model will predict that the energy should keep on decreasing as the assistance level increases, right? So in this case, the assistance level can be the symmetry between the belts, but it could be sort of generalized to things like a wearable robotic exoskeleton, for instance. And so it says that, so the model will predict that, oh, as you provide more assistance, people should keep on decreasing the energy cost. But this is sort of a learning agnostic view, because the question is it actually easy to learn, or are there other sort of demands that prevent the person from learning the correct strategy when you provide higher assistance? And so trajectory optimization models can't really speak to that. And indeed, what we found is that humans actually show the opposite trend. So as the assistance level increases, the energy cost actually increases in humans. Okay, and so we wanted to see if the learning model can explain why this happens. Interestingly, in addition to, okay, so I told you that as the assistance level increases, instead of the sort of energy cost decreasing, energy cost actually seems to be increasing. And also, interestingly, the time scale on which energy is minimized also increases. So this is completely unexplained in the literature, and it's also a phenomenon we discovered without intending to. Okay, so it seems like when you're put in a novel context, not only do you find suboptimal strategies, you also take longer somehow to discover them. And so we wanted to see if our learning model can explain this. And so what we did is we fit the model. Specifically, we fit the learning rate and the symmetry weight of the model. So the model tries to minimize energy cost while also having a cost for symmetry. And so it's this trade-off between symmetry and energy, which is what I'm calling the symmetry weight here. Okay, and so we fit it to each individual, meaning and this is a simulation in the loop, right? So we tried to use the simulation to match the curves that individuals were exhibiting, and thus found like each individual's best fit learning rate and symmetry weight. And interestingly, when we graph this is the heat map that you see in the background is the set of all possible symmetry, weight, and learning rate combinations. And then in red is what people seem to choose. What's really interesting is that as the assistance level increases in this device, people seem to shift to safer and safer regions of this landscape. And so what we did is for each combination of parameters, we simulated the model many times to see how often it fell down. And we assigned a fall risk. And so if it fell down 100% of the time, then it's yellow. If it fell down like very, very less, it's blue. And so that's the risk landscape. And so it seems that people actually seem to be changing their learning rate and their symmetry weight in a way that tries to stay in safer and safer regions of the fall risk landscape. And what this has told us now is that using this learning model, we're able to explain why energetically suboptimal behavior is occurring. It's perhaps occurring because people are avoiding unsafe solutions that will lead to higher fall risk. And in other words, this sort of learning model can give us insight into how safe learning is achieved across contexts. Okay, so this is to summarize the last part of my talk, which was on learning rules. So humans seem to explore the neighborhood of a stabilizing controller when learning to move in a novel environment. Slower adaptation in some environments seems to be explained by avoiding fall risk in those environments. And so the implications of these findings is that we can use these kinds of formal models of human motor learning to discover model guided curricula to accelerate motor learning. We can come up with human inspired safety critical learning in robots, for instance. We can do adaptation aware human robot interaction by incorporating these kinds of adaptation models into wearable robot control. And we can also come up with phenotypes for different impaired disorders. As I showed you, sort of the going away of the learning is a very classic phenomenon in individuals with cerebellar ataxia. And so we can look at different deficits and how they show up in the behavior and then map that back to the model. Okay, so that concludes sort of my talk pretty much. I will add the thank you to all the amazing individuals who've contributed to this work. Let me tell their names one by one. So in the first part of a lot of the sort of talk that borrowed from my older work was done with Manoj Srinivasan. In the initial work, the thing about babies exploring environments was done by Itkal Deljet, Krista Falk, and Nikasha Patel. The work about system identification was done by Eric Wong, and also Antoine and across species. And then the work on using our adaptation model to understand how fall risk shapes learning was done by Insang Kang. And I also want to thank my collaborators, Justine, Karen, Sasha, and Monica. Thank you, everybody. So you can ask me questions now for sort of all the parts of the talk or whatever you remember. I'll leave us on this slide just in case it helps.
Yeah, thank you, Nidhi. Like, anyone have any questions? Feel free to jump in. I guess I will ask one so I'm curious how do you see the developmental prior and and of like the sensory motor prior that is born with us like we never learn, right? Like infants never learn to walk. They like somehow they just know how to walk. Like how do you see that?
That's a great question. I think it's very controversial to say that infants don't learn how to walk, they know to walk. I think there's certainly some sort of neuroscientists who believe that, but a lot of developmental psychologists don't believe that that is true. And I think it also makes sense that it won't be true. I mean, it may not be as tabula rasa learning as deep reinforcement learning, for instance, but infants, their bodies change a lot, right? And so if they don't have some sort of adaptive or plasticity, adaptation or plasticity associated with locomotion, then they won't be able to adapt their strategies to a changing body, right? And so surely there is some amount of learning involved. How much is maybe the more interesting question. And so to your question, how much of it is sensory motor priors versus how much is learning is something that we are very interested in. We're actually more specifically interested in understanding which parts of locomotion are actually preloaded and which parts are learned. And we have some very interesting recent results that we're writing up on this. And we find that there's a particular dissociation between spatial and temporal components, wherein the spatial component seems much more learned than the temporal component, which actually seems to change a lot on developmental timescales.
That's very interesting. So like the periodic controller is actually born, and then like the spatial is actually learned.
The opposite. It's actually very surprising. We actually find that the opposite is true.
So the
So
spatial is
the spatial is actually very adult-like already. And the temporal component actually changes the most on developmental times.
wow. That's very interesting. I mean that actually contradict the central pattern generator hypothesis that people have been talking about, right?
I don't think it needs to contradict it because actually um, what I'm talking about is the variability, and variability doesn't directly map to learning. And so, in some sense, it could actually be exploration, right? So, in the sense that maybe the CPG, maybe one reason to limit variability along the dimension that has the worst prior and increase variability along the dimension that has a better prior is actually a good idea. And so we're trying different hypotheses. The CPG is one of the hypotheses that we're testing. That perhaps even a reinforcement learning agent that has a central pattern generator will also counterintuitively exhibit more variability in the temporal dimension because it will use it more to learn about the environment. So I think in a learning framework, it can be explained, contrary to your idea that people are preloaded with walking.
I see. It also sounds like if we do the system identification or like controller design really well, we don't even need deep reinforcement learning or some kind of this like deep learning methods to achieve robust control, right? Like human-like control. Like
I
it's
think I think this question of learning versus how much is learned versus how much is just pre-trained is, I think, very interesting. And I would say that humans almost surely do some kind of learning. Like everything is not pre-trained, right? It's almost obvious. Like nobody is born knowing how to do ballet, right? So it's like there is certainly some amount of learning. I think again the interesting question is how much, not whether or not.
yeah. Yeah, I guess like anyone else want to jump in? I guess like people can just email Needy by the end of the talk. We actually went over for 30 minutes, but like, I think we it's a lot of interesting results and thoughts like people if want to revisit the talk and just it's going to get uploaded to YouTube like right after. So like people just feel free to revisit the talk via YouTube or just email Needy. And thank you Needy so much for being here and have such a wonderful lecture to teach us so many things. Yeah.
Thanks everyone. It was wonderful. Thanks for staying extra. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Sorry. I have one more question.
Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
I think learning is always risky, but where is the trade-off between the risk and the learning?
That's a great point. Actually, so we have a paper we are writing right now on how sort of the risk of falling or the risk of failure affects
Yeah.
motor learning. There's a lot of literature on how uncertainty affects motor learning, which is a different kind of risk. It's like a statistical risk, but here we're actually talking about a physical risk of failure. And the short story is that it does shape learning in a very fundamental way. And I will ask you to stay tuned for the paper to find out the punchline, which I'm not going to give you today. But if you give me your email, I'll send you the paper when it's done.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, very nice questions. Yeah, so anyone have last minute questions? Okay, I guess we'll actually call it an end. Thank you, Nidhi. It's been
Bye,
great time.
everyone.
Yep. See you, everyone.
Bye, bye.